Welcome back to another episode of Do More With Your Money. On today's episode, I'm joined by money expert and certified financial planner, Shannah Game. Shannah is the host of the podcast Everyone's Talking Money, formerly Millennial Money, which has nearly 1,200 episodes and over 25 million downloads. She's also the author of Unraveling Your Relationship with Money, Ditch Your Money Trauma so you can live an abundant life. With that wealth of money knowledge, I'm excited and honored to be able to speak with you today, and hopefully can help some people do more with their money. So Shannah, thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a joy to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, I was doing some research on you previously, and you've had a really awesome career, and obviously you've had a ton of conversations around money, so hopefully we can tap into some things that you haven't previously spoken about. But I would love to start a little bit about what is your why, and how did you get to this point? Why are you so passionate about helping people with money?
Yeah, I have a really bizarre path, as I would imagine most people do. I actually started my first business when I was in college, and it was really successful, but really that's where I think I got my toolkit around money, where I really learned kind of nuts and bolts. And then when I graduated, I went and got an MBA, and I was kind of trying to figure out what I was going to do next. And I had sold my business, and my father, who was in the financial industry, said, "Hey, why don't you come work with me at a small financial firm?" And what I started to realize was that whether you were super wealthy or you were, like my MBA cohorts, most people knew nothing about personal finance, nothing about money. And they also shared the same hangups, the same fears, the same blocks. And so I really started to become passionate about, hey, I need to figure out a way to kind of combine my expertise and my creativity and teach more people about money in a way that I think is easily digestible. So that's really been my mission to everything that I've done in my career.
No, that's amazing, and it's always good to have that powerful why, because it leads to having the passion to help others, which I think is great. And it's funny, being a financial planner myself, I definitely have revisited some of kind of my money trauma or reasons why I developed certain mindsets around money, and I've heard you reference that in some of the things on your website. And so I'd love to hear if you can explain what does money trauma mean? What is that? How does it create certain financial behaviors within us?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, because a lot of people are like, money trauma? I've never heard of that before, but it's really just the emotional and psychological impact of financial stress and really any negative money experience that somebody has. And these could be big things. It could be growing up in financial poverty. It could be also, a sudden financial loss, like maybe you got laid off from your job. But it could also be tiny things, like maybe you forgot to pay one of your bills and you had a late fee and your credit score dipped, and all of a sudden your brain and body went into this sort of trauma response, because money is so emotional. So trauma really affects people at all different levels, because it's about the emotional relationship to money. It's not about how much money somebody has in their bank account, which I think is a little difficult for most people to wrap their head around, because they think, oh, if I have millions of dollars or I make six figures or whatever it is, there's no way I'm going to have any financial trauma or any, issues around money. And I know from working with people of all different denominations, probably like yourself, that is not the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And what are some financial behaviors that you've seen in the people that you've spoken to or working with that you can identify as far as, I guess, certain types of mindsets, whether it's scarcity or maybe on the other side of the equation, like spendthrift? What are some things that you see?
Definitely scarcity I see with almost every human that I've worked with. I hear this a lot. I feel, quote unquote, I feel like there's never enough. So I've heard that from people making all different denominations. And it's really interesting to me that most of us grow up with that kind of story around money, that there's never going to be enough money. I'll never make enough money. Money's running out. So I think that would be a real predominant pattern that I see with people. But then, yeah, there's the flip side as well. The real spendthrift, doesn't want to take any risks, is ultra conservative, super scared about spending money on anything. And those two dichotomies, if you will. Most people fall into one of those two categories and then tend to switch around throughout their life. But I think that, there's just a lot of fear around money, and primarily because most people don't even know how they're spending their money. They don't even know where their money is going. And so it creates this sometimes even irrational fear and this sense of trauma. But, we kind of keep that, money thing like hidden, right? We don't want to open that like Pandora's box.
Absolutely. And I think about this for myself. I came from a family where, my dad was one of six, immigrants, and his father unfortunately passed away when he was a child. So he was raised by a single mother and really developed that kind of scarcity mindset around money. And it was so important to him. And we had a lot of conversations about it, growing up. And he felt very comfortable with real estate, for example, because it was like tangible, right? If the stock market to him felt too kind of ambiguous and like out there in the metaverse, and then on the other side, like my mom, did come from a little bit of money, and her grandfather was an entrepreneur, and she kind of didn't necessarily have that same understanding of money and was a little bit more, careless with it. So I kind of saw these two very different ends of the spectrum, and naturally it made me want to be a financial planner and figure out like, okay, what's going on? How do we actually use money? And I know you, your podcast was formerly Millennial Money, which I think is great because I'm a millennial myself, and I like to work with millennials. But what do you think some things that like millennials specifically are dealing with today as far as like the money decisions that they're having to make?
Well, I think everything is so much more expensive. And so the idea of being able to afford a house, the idea of just being able to, go on vacations and enjoy life is difficult for a lot of millennials, especially those who live in big cities where the pressure is just so intense and, everything is so expensive. But I think there's also that other side of millennial, which don't want to wait until they're 60, 65, 70 to enjoy their life. And there's that real push for, no, I should be able to enjoy my life and spend my money along the way. And I think that's really hard, especially with social media. You see so many people out there like, I'm location independent and I make all this money. And I think it's really easy to think like, God, why can't I do that? Or why isn't my life set up that way? And there's, I think, just so many new financial pressures. Millennials are probably the first generation to really have massive student loan debt and to have to balance that with everything else. And so I think it can feel as a millennial like all the sides are really closing in on you and you just don't know what to do to actually get ahead financially.
Yeah, absolutely. I see that. It feels like a lot of millennials think that they have to take, substantial risks to get ahead, whether that's like buying, speculative individual stocks or investing in really, speculative cryptocurrencies because they feel like they're so behind in the game and they've seen maybe their boomer, parents who have really benefited from the growth of real estate, but the affordability, like you mentioned, has gone down. And so they feel this societal pressure that they need to maybe purchase that home or upgrade their lifestyle when they haven't really achieved it. So I guess like what are some ways that millennials can start to take like positive steps in identifying maybe some of these negative financial behaviors, and like what are some things that they can do to provide more peace of mind, to build good habits? What do you think about that?
Wow, there's so many things. I mean, kind of going along the trauma side of things, talking from that perspective, I think that most people don't realize that about 95% of your money decisions are emotional. So where does that come from? Well, we have to look at how we were raised around money and something called your money story. And going back and really looking at that and unpacking some of those beliefs, some of those stories, some of those feelings around money that you carried into your adulthood is actually really important. And I know a lot of people think, I got to skip over this step, but you and I both know that shapes the foundation of the decisions that you do or don't make into adulthood. So I think spending some time and thinking about like, what were those narratives that you heard as a kid? Like money doesn't grow on trees, or there's never enough money. What were some of those narratives you heard? And can you trace them and track them to where you are currently with your money situation and your money habits? Most of us can. Most of us are like, oh man, I do that thing that my parents do. So you shared a little bit about your story, but my dad was in the financial industry, but we would go on these vacations, nice vacations, and when we would come home, the whole flight home or the whole drive home, he was looking through the itemized receipt of all the expenses and talking about like, oh my gosh, somebody bought a, $12 grilled cheese, and we just felt terrible. And I didn't recognize as a kid, but how it materialized as an adult was you can't enjoy anything. Like you can't go out and spend money and just enjoy it. So as an adult, I would go out to eat and I would have a great meal, but on the ride home, I'd be talking about how expensive that meal was. And I really had to train myself and also let it be okay to spend money. It's okay to spend money on things. And so it's really about detaching some of those narratives that you grew up with and figuring out what you actually want your beliefs going forward. And then letting those beliefs shape how you save and spend your money going forward, because you actually have a choice in that. And then besides that, I mean, it's, people want the sexy stuff, but it's the basics, right? It's knowing where your money's going. It's having some sort of intentional spending. It's, saving some money. It's investing it so it grows beyond your bank account. I mean, there aren't too many, crystal ball secrets about money and growing wealth. But what gets in the way of that are our emotions, are our habits, are our thoughts and feelings around money. And until we can step back and kind of look at those through a mirror, then we can't start changing the outcome on the other side.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So it starts within us to identify kind of our relationship with money. Are we using it intentionally as a tool? And, it is unfortunate that, we live in an inflationary environment, and, some people are stuck in this kind of wage earner cycle where they're, basically not taking any of their earnings and translating it into assets that are going to hopefully not just increase with inflation, but increase above it. And so they're, again, stuck in this wage earner cycle. And kind of that's why we have this growing, wealth disparity. And so, again, this comes back so much to kind of financial literacy, what you were told, the stories you were told as a child. I guess like on the other side of the equation, I'm starting to work with a lot of millennials who are starting to have children. And it's like, how do you, not only kind of identify your money trauma and fix those, but also how do you create good money habits for children, for your children, and what lessons can you pass on to them?
That is such a great question. And I think it's a really tricky one because most parents don't even want to talk to their kids about money because they don't understand money themselves. And so there's, I think, a deep shame that exists in a lot of parents of, I don't have this all figured out. Like, who am I to go and teach my children? But the important thing to know is that they are watching and listening to everything. And, they're little sponges, right? And so there's a stat that says that by age 7, actually your money personality is pretty much set in stone. You can change it, of course, but that just shows you how early on we develop this language around money, this understanding of money. So I think really thinking about how you talk about money with your kids. Is it from a negative perspective or is it from something positive? Like, for instance, I worked with a couple who decided, even their young kids, they would set a budget for their trips. And they would say, okay, we have, $1,000, let's say, to go on this trip. Let's all together figure out how we want to spend that money. And the kids quickly realized, like, wow, that $1,000 went super fast. But they were learning these lessons and they were participating in these conversations around money and developing a relationship that was more accessible than just, oh my gosh, we never have money, or, my parents always fight about money, or, some of those things. So I think just being really cognizant of how you're talking about money, how you're interacting, and then kids can actually have the capacity to learn a lot about money if we empower them to do so. And I think, don't be afraid about even making a mistake in front of your kid around money, but it's helpful to have that dialogue and teach them that it's okay to have these conversations.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I love the idea of kind of like, empowering them to make some decisions, to have some skin in the game. So maybe like, yeah, when you're going out to purchase a new toy or something, it's like, hey, you could either have this toy or you could have the money to do something else with. So then it's about making a decision like, do I really want this? Or would I rather have the money? And then also just understanding the basics of like, if I put away this money and invest it, like when they're old enough to understand that I can kind of benefit from this idea of compound interest and why and delayed gratification. And so I think those are all great messages to share. So obviously, you're a money expert, financial planner, all these things. Like, how do you maintain a healthy relationship with money? Is this a lifelong journey? Do you conquer it? Like, what does that look like for you?
For me, it's a lifelong journey. And I think for most people, if they're going to be honest, it is as well. I mean, this is really what inspired me writing my book, Unraveling Your Relationship with Money, is my journey around money and seeing how, even as a money expert, I still struggle with so many things and still do, and that I'm not dissimilar from anybody else. I share this story in the book that I used to, when, I'm kind of dating myself, but when I used to go drive up to an ATM and, deposit money or take out money, I would fold up the receipts into some origami shape and just put them in the back of my wallet, and I would never look at them. And it wasn't that I didn't have money in my bank account. That wasn't the problem. The problem was my monkey brain around money starts subtracting all of these things that I know I have to pay. And, in a split second, I've got myself homeless. I've got myself, with no money. Like I've done that mental gymnastics very quickly. And so, to avoid that, I just would never look. Well, not looking actually is not helping either because it's keeping that scenario going on. So, I really had to do a lot of work around setting up what I call space, like giving myself rules of engagement. When we think about money, it's a relationship. Just like if I was in a relationship with someone else, right? It requires trust. It requires boundaries. It requires communication. It requires all these things. But when we think about money, we don't tend to think about it that way, but we need to. So for me, my personal experience is it's going to be a complete journey. I'm going to be on that journey until, my last breath. And I think for most people, that's the case. And it's really why I like to preach a message of, this is not about perfection. This is just about progress. And some days are going to suck and some days are going to be better. And the reality is nobody's going to talk about it, but everybody's going through the same battle, the same journey.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I find myself still, having conversations just to figure out my relationship with money. And, as I had that scarcity mindset as well, and I still do. But as my resources grow, I'm really trying to challenge myself to kind of think of the money as a tool, right? When I have a surplus, it's like, how can I help, the people that I care about, or use the money as a tool to maybe buy back my time, or, really think about kind of over the course of one's lifetime. The book I read recently, Die with Zero. I don't know if you've...
Yes.
But it was a great idea, great, mindset as far as like making sure that you're thinking over the course of your lifetime, like when are you really going to derive the most value and utility, from your money? I guess what are some things along that same mindset that you would suggest for people about thinking about, maybe, gifting to family members earlier, or spending money?
Yeah, I love the idea of gifting. We were talking about children. Like, I love the idea of gifting them money for investing and like teaching them about that from a very early age. But I think there's such a voice out there that we always have to be saving. And I think obviously saving is great. We know the stats that very few people have enough money to cover, I think, a $600 emergency. So right. We understand the statistics around that, but there is such a fear around spending money. And for instance, I worked with a young lady who had ADHD, and she was also bipolar. And she would go on these, what she called, these are her words, a manic spending spree. And she was trying to figure out what to do because other people that she had worked with were telling her, well, you just have to stop spending money.
Mm-hmm.
And that didn't work because it just doesn't work that way, right? And so what we did was we actually set up a separate savings account. We called it manic spending. And so whenever she had those feelings, instead of trying to suppress it, she would go to that account, and whatever money was in that account was fair game for her. And so I think allowing yourself to have, whether it's a fun money fund or whatever you want to call it, but allowing yourself to spend money does a lot for your relationship with money, because you can have some sort of freedom. It isn't just about, cutting out everything in your life. You can gift to people, you can gift to your favorite charities. There's a lot of good that you can do with money, even just a small amount of money, to help yourself and to help other people.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that, hopefully as people grow their resources, they're not tighter with their money. They're more, loose with it, in the sense that they're being intentional about using it for things that they derive value from, whether it's helping others or taking back their time, improving their life, etc. I think one thing, back to, thinking about millennials again, and, I've been working with some couples who are kind of starting to merge their finances. And sometimes they come in with a his and her mindset. It's kind of rare that they come in with a joint mindset, although I try to encourage them to think about it that way, especially when you're taxed as a joint unit. What are some, things that you would encourage people that are, going down this path of combining finances? Like, how do you think about managing finances as a joint unit?
The first thing I will say is probably a little bit controversial, but I actually encourage healthy disagreements from couples around money. I think we tend to think, oh, we need to avoid those kind of conversations, but healthy disagreements actually help you learn a lot if you let it be that exercise of your partner. And I think when we're coming into a relationship, right, we each have our own money story. We each have our own trauma. We each have our own baggage. And so we need to approach it more from a sense of curiosity versus blame. And if we start by asking questions of the other person from a curiosity perspective, I think it's super helpful. So having these kind of open-ended conversations about, hey, we have extra money this month. What are some of the things we could do with it? Or what do we want to do 5 years down the line? What's important to you? Or even asking questions. Hey, what were the messages you learned when you grew up around money? How do you think that impacts you today? So approaching these things that we would normally come in and just kind of hammer the other person with this sense of curiosity is super helpful. One of the things I suggest for couples is something I call a don't ask, don't tell spending limit. So it's setting a certain amount of money, whether it's $50, $100, $1,000, it's whatever works for you as a couple. That's the amount of money that you can each spend, no questions asked. You don't have to sneak in the packages. You don't have to do any of that nonsense. Anything over that requires just a quick little check-in. Hey, I was thinking of buying this. It's this amount of money. Cool. Is that going to, hinder any of our financial goals? No. Great. Okay, go ahead. So I think we need to, establish some of these boundaries around money and give each other permission to not, again, have to be perfect. And the other person has a completely different story, a completely different trauma, a completely different upbringing. And so we need to be able to honor both of those to create a healthy relationship around money.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, if you are, combining finances with your partner, really just, have an open space to be able to understand the differences around how your money story evolved, maybe some of the mindsets you differ on as far as using money, and then giving each other space to have some room to spend without feeling judged about specifics as far as.
Absolutely. And I think whether you combine finances or not, these are still important things to talk about. I think you've probably experienced this too. I've worked with a lot of couples that are like, we never have to talk about money because we don't have our, any of our accounts joined. And I said, okay, well, let's just say, what happens if one of you is disabled or hurt or can't work? What happens then? And it's like, well, I don't think that's going to happen. And I'm like, well, okay, let's just pretend it does. What happens then? And so I think it's important to not just put yourself in the corner of we never have to deal with these things because we don't have combined finances. If we're in a relationship or we're married, certainly, we can't avoid these things because they're important things to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is interesting how people, like you said, some people feel very uncomfortable talking about finances because maybe when they were growing up, their parents didn't talk about money at all. So that feels like taboo to them. And, working with a financial planner, somebody that's an expert in money, that can help you kind of break through those barriers. To switch gears a little bit, one thing that, at least some of the people that I come across are really interested in is this idea of financial independence, where they have enough investment assets where they can, meet their income or spending needs and not have to work, right? Work optional. However, sometimes people haven't achieved financial independence, but they're very excited by this idea, but they really want to try to expedite that as fast as possible. They want to have this really high savings rate, live below their means, and sacrifice a ton to get there. My concern is that maybe they're going to sacrifice too much and then regret that later on. What is your thoughts around kind of this whole financial independence movement? You think it's a good thing? You think people are making too much sacrifices? What do you think? What do you think about that?
I mean, financial independence is always fantastic, right? We can wrap that up with a little bow. Like that just sounds amazing. Who wouldn't want to get to that place? I know a lot of people, though, who did what you have laid out, where they sacrificed, got to that place. And when they got to that place, they realized, I don't know if I actually like this place very much. Sure, I have money, but now I don't have my career. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't have a vision. Like, the vision was to get to this place, but they didn't think about or imagine what comes after that. Like, where are we going next? And so they reached this mile marker, and there was this great kind of letdown, which was very ironic because they got there, they saved, they did all of the things. So I think, financial independence is great and it's amazing, but I really want you to think about why. Like, why are you doing this? What happens when you hit that mark? Then what? Where do you go from there? And the idea of work optional, I think, sounds really great when we have to work. It sounds fantastic. But that you could look at so many different scientific, psychological studies. Most humans need some sort of work, hobby, purpose, passion. We need something that drives us forward. And, so I think really rooting into what is that for you? What are you doing on the other side of this place is an important consideration. So you don't get there and realize like, wow, I'm, for lack of a better word, I wasted all of these years struggling, not experiencing life. And I got to this place and now I don't know what I'm doing with my life.
Yeah, it's like the retiree, the traditional retiree, maybe like baby boomer generation that worked at the same job for 30 years straight. They retire, and then like you said, we have the data around that as far as like, unfortunately, a lot of people like die right after they retire because they lose their sense of purpose and their identity. And this is why it's so important to have an identity outside of just your work, outside of your net worth, because if you put all your eggs in that basket, you may find that was not a worthwhile pursuit. And so that's why I also, try to encourage people that are kind of like trying to get to this financial independence. It's like, well, that's great. Like you said, it's like, but what are you going to actually do once you achieve that? Yeah,
it's really interesting because it's, so much about money is like, we want to get to these goalposts. We want to get to these places. But if we don't know what we're doing on the other side, we get there and it's like, okay, well, what next? And so I think really understanding what you're saying that, we have to separate our net worth from our self-worth. And we have to really, tune into who we are, what makes us tick, if we're going down that road of pursuing financial independence early.
I love that. Net worth is not self-worth. And I think that's really important because, in the society we live in and with, like you said, social media and seeing what everybody has, a lot of times it's easy to fall into that trap of thinking that you are what your income is or what your net worth is. And so easier said than done, obviously, but there's always going to be somebody with more money than you. And so I think it's probably best to learn to not play that game early on. So circling back to your book, I want to talk about unraveling your relationship with money. Like, who is this, geared towards? Like, who is the target audience?
Wow. Well, me as the author, I would say anyone. But I think primarily between the ages of 30 and 55-ish, in those working years, maybe you've been, slapped around a little bit by money. Things maybe haven't gone exactly the way you wanted it to. And you're kind of thinking, okay, why, what is the secret? Why can't I do X? Why can't I figure out how to pay off my debt? Why can't I reach financial independence? Something has to be going on. So it's kind of the prescription for that, and helping you really understand that there is this thing called relationship with money, and that it does play a big role in your ability to achieve certain goals. And that it is an important piece of, if we're looking at the overall financial plan, it's an important piece that needs to have an understanding. So the book is also, it's not heavy. I did not want to write a heavy finance book. It's my story. It's other people's stories. It's humorous. There are things you're going to connect with, things you're going to think are absolutely crazy. And a lot of questions to just help you think about some of these things that we've talked about in this conversation, and maybe you've never even thought about these things.
Awesome. Well, I'll definitely make sure to link to the book in the show notes. And then, I always like to kind of end with, if you did have one takeaway you'd like to leave with the audience for how they can do more with their money. It could be mindset wise, it could be spending, saving, investing, paying down debt, anything that you'd like to leave the audience with.
Well, I would say the one thing that I would like to leave the audience with is understanding that the reason you make certain money choices is more about what's going on in your head and body than what's going on in your bank account.
No, I love that. And that is a message that we all need to hear more, because if we don't identify that and address that, then it's going to make making changes very difficult beyond that. So
1,000%.
Well, awesome. Where is the best place that people can connect with you?
Yeah, you can pre-order my book on Everyone's Talkin', TALKIN money.com/book. They have some amazing pre-order bonuses. You can also check out my podcast. Like you said, I have over 1,200 episodes on any podcast player. Everyone's Talkin' Money.
Awesome. Well, Shannah, thank you so much for coming on. This was an amazing conversation, and thank you for coming on again.
Thanks for having me.